I often find myself lying awake in the middle of the night, thinking that my life has been a big lie. Since I was a child, I've tried to live up to standards that are so unobtainable that I now feel very damaged. You think when you leave that you might be able to completely heal. The truth is, it gets better, in fact much better, but that life still affects parts of you. My name is Drew Hunter. At the time of making this video, I am 47 years old. I spent my childhood and most of my adult years as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I used to be a Mormon, and this is the story of my journey to a new life. There's two worlds in our everyday lives. One that's mainly on the surface, the one we present out in public to others. It's really a facade, it's a cover. It's almost like there's an unspoken rule and we just go along with it, everyone just goes along with it. Then there's the other world, the one that should matter most, but the one we're encouraged to disguise with the surface version. This better world is our real life, the one lived inside our homes and away from glowing screens. Sometimes the boundary between both these worlds is blurred. It's when it gets difficult to tell the difference between what is genuine and real and what is fake. That's, I think, when something might be seriously wrong. It's just about stepping out of the thickness of that imitation, to come out and see yourself as if looking at a mirror reflecting back to your true self. I see myself as an analytical thinker. I'm obsessed with finding out how the world works, why people, groups, organisations act the way that they do. I like to observe, I like to dissect, to deconstruct my surroundings. Making this video has allowed me to take over 40 years of my life and try to make sense of it. This is an essential stage of my therapy because at this moment in time I am recovering from being part of a religious sect, being part of a cult. I think of a wonderful statement by a scientist who studies these things, organisations that control, Alice Greskin, who said, "Questioning faith takes courage. Leaving your religion can be life-shattering." So, in more recent years, as the Mormon Church, the LDS Church, has had to face dwindling numbers and an almost endless volley of questions that are brought on by a more informed and intellectually liberated membership, it's become extremely common for active church members to utter that often repeated phrase, "If you've left the church, then why don't you just leave it alone?" And by extension, I'm sure what they mean is, can you just leave us alone? You've left. You don't need to bother with us anymore. It's a common statement which is almost as old as the church itself. And I guess at face value, it makes sense. You're not a Mormon anymore. You don't accept Mormonism. Therefore, live the other life you've chosen and forget about the church. And I think this is when we begin to understand that such a narrow value judgment is seldom adequate to cover the complexity of going through a faith crisis. Knowing what it feels like and seeing many others experience the psychological side effects of an actualized faith crisis is a journey that leaves scars and drains emotional energy. It is no small life event. It's individually complex. What has happened to me and to my family was not done in some corner of the world. If any active member of the LDS Church were to listen to this account, they're likely to consider what I have to say as disparaging and at odds with their entire life. As an ex-Mormon, it is natural to react in such a way for active church members to place less value on anything that I'm going to say from here on in. They may even view my comments as evil, ignorant, or from a position of threat. I have no control over the reaction to my comments being made. I do, however, welcome discussion if anyone wanted to get in contact. I'm happy to discuss these things. But for any person who really knows me, whether they be Mormon or not, hopefully they don't see a malevolent, vindictive, or conniving person seeking to ruin their lives. That is so far from my nature. I am an ex-Mormon who isn't motivated in this way. For those who don't know me, I guess what I'm doing is I'm inviting a portion of your trust for you to be receptive, if you can be, to what I'm saying. That all being said, I will refer to Mormon beliefs, ideology, doctrine, church administration in ways that true believers will find very disagreeable. I am not here to pour honey into anyone's ear. I've spent enough of my life pleasing people and doing the bidding of an organisation. I love open and honest dialogue. I value opinions and alternative viewpoints. If anyone has issue with anything said from here on in, then, as I said, you can contact me. I am a very findable person. One last point before I go into a lot of detail. It's one thing to take another's views or interpretation of facts and to disagree. And I hope it's done with the kind of honesty and integrity that good Mormons profess to in the 13th Article of Faith, for example. However, it's a completely different undertaking for a devoted LDS Church member to take a non-believer or ex-Mormon's lived and real experiences and pour some sort of scorn or disbelief onto them. If there was one crucial lesson I learned from my time as a member of the church, it was the necessity for human empathy. You don't have to see facts from my perspective to understand what I've personally gone through. As I begin to talk about the next part of my time as a Mormon, I want to introduce it with a quote from Plato in the allegory of the cave. He makes a statement: how could they see anything but the shadows if they were never allowed to move their heads? And that makes me think of my time as an active Mormon. So my parents were converts to the church when our young family lived in the town of Paisley in Scotland. Two very nice and charismatic young Mormon missionaries braved the streets in Paisley in our local area, and they struck up a conversation with my dad at the door. They'd been chapping doors in the area, and this was in the late 70s. And there seemed to be a connection made between my dad and the missionaries, and eventually my mum as well. So my parents invited the two young boys back for another appointment, and all the rest is history. I was 4 years old. My brother was a few years older than me. From that time onward, our family became fully devoted and active members of the Mormon faith. I experienced all of the typical milestones of a Mormon child. I was baptized at the age of 8. I was given the priesthood at the age of 12. Years before this, our whole family had made the long journey by coach to the London Temple, which was the nearest temple at the time, so that we could be sealed together for eternity. In Mormonism, as in many other Christian groups, there is a focus on eschatology, the belief in the end of time, the return of Jesus Christ, and a final judgment of all people on the earth. Therefore, it was important that our family was connected together in life and for the afterlife, so that our family could be together for eternity. This is a very foundational and powerful doctrine within Mormonism. To think that we can be with our loved ones after we have died. Therefore, when someone in a particular Mormon family leaves the church, this can lead to concern or even anger from devoted church members. It's common for fallouts within families to occur. So at this point, I feel it's important to explain something I learned many years later about human biology. Studying psychology at university was fantastic, and having taught it in high school, it's been an important part of processing my faith crisis, actually. Our brains are remarkably complex muscles. It's where we experience our emotions and how we process our senses. As we move from birth to adulthood, our brains experience periods of growth and development. Our environment, our upbringing, and the social influence of others are very powerful forces in the formation of our character's nature and our worldview. There is an essential plasticity in the neural circuitry of the brain. This allows us to develop those early bonds and relationships with our family, one of the most beautiful things in child and human development. The important connections that make up who we are developed in our earliest years. But we are equally vulnerable to control and manipulation by individuals and groups who may have not the best of intentions or sometimes good intentions, but just as damaging. Even their attempts to use methods of manipulation to have psychological purchase over us are grounded in a kind of group conformity dynamic. When humans form groups, those groups can be very powerful and influential, and they can be uncontrollably destructive too. Think of many of the most disturbing acts of cruelty in human history, and in most instances, the malevolence of crowds is behind these events. It normally takes a trigger, but that's how it works in group dynamics. This latency of group conformity eventually manifests itself when someone like me tries to point out that the group is saying or doing things that are not in our best interests. Then an echo chamber of self-confirmation unleashes, as devoted Mormons or whatever group mold together to defend the status quo. It's the kind of behaviour we see playing out on social media. Ironically, I suppose groups of ex-Mormons will coalesce into similar groups for support also. An important point really has to be made here, and I consider this one of society's biggest issues. When someone becomes a real victim of institutional abuse, that is not a shared experience by the rest of the organisation. Everyone's experience is personal and different. Equally, if you or anyone you know within your social group has not been harmed by membership in that group, that does not mean that harm does not happen to others. Of course it does. There is an error in simple reasoning at play when doubt about mistreatment or abuse for a victim or victims is shown simply because you or people in your immediate social group haven't experienced it yourself. When human beings are exposed to institutional authority, particularly from infancy, they can find themselves unknowingly trapped in an ideologically restrictive life. I've learned through several years of slow and tedious deprogramming that I was controlled by the authority and teachings of the Mormon Church. I was taught the importance of free agency, sometimes described as moral agency, but I've since realised how far from reality that life actually was. My wife, Tracy, has come to this realisation also, as have our own children. And this is a kind of myth of agency that there is within the Mormon Church. My wife was raised as a Mormon too. Her family have a very similar story to our own. Her parents became members of the Mormon Church through young missionaries at a time similar to our own family. As we are the same age, she experienced the same events and religious rituals as the years went by, except the priesthood, of course. It is no surprise then that we would eventually meet through our mutual experiences and membership in the church. We weren't that far away from each other geographically. And there's an entire aspect of Mormonism that's geared towards the youth. Young Mormons are expected to live by very strict standards of moral behaviour. They don't drink alcohol, they don't smoke, they don't take drugs, they don't have sex until they are married. Young Mormons are expected to dress in a way that the church considers appropriate. The standards are very high. We met through youth events, which we enjoyed. It didn't take us long to develop a strong relationship. We absolutely fell in love with each other. We were completely head over heels for each other. But this was not in line with our expected path as young Mormons. As a young boy, it was essential, I suppose, that I serve a mission for the church when I turned 18 or 19 years old. Developing such a strong relationship with a young Mormon woman was not considered advisable. However, Tracy and I grew closer together, and eventually our relationship created a bit of a scandal. When she became pregnant, there was a huge backlash and reaction from the local leadership. Within our respective church congregations, we felt very guilty for what had happened, because guilt and shame are two very powerful emotional reactions that most Mormons have to accept. In a strictly religious setting, feelings of guilt are considered normal and as mental signposts of unacceptable behaviours. We had broken one of the most important moral rules in Mormonism. Therefore, we had to be disciplined because of it. We were married in the early 90s at a young age, and it was what we wanted. In spite of comments being made by ecclesiastical leaders of the possibility of me still serving a mission for the church, or of our unborn child possibly being given up for adoption, we were stubbornly in love with each other. This was our choice. In the face of such intimidating authority, Tracy and I happily started our journey together. And now, 30 years later, with 7 children and 6 grandchildren, we remain a strong family. But a lot has changed in the intervening years. 30 years is a long time. Having a big family is no doubt a relatable and not unusual choice for married couples in Mormonism. We felt it was meant to be, and as tough as it was, we ploughed on, trying our best to raise our growing family. Each of them was loved in our eyes and collectively taught how to be a good Mormon, but more importantly, how to be good people. Not at any time did Tracy and I think that our parenting was strange or in any way remotely damaging. As was the case in the Mormon household, the men were priesthood holders with various responsibilities. The women were given roles within aspects of leadership too, but not the priesthood. At some point, I was given the responsibility to teach the adults in Sunday school each week, and I loved that role. I had been a youth leader, a seminary teacher, amongst other positions, so I actually felt naturally drawn to teaching, which set me on a path that changed my life significantly. Having neglected my school education at a younger age, I learned the value of education after I was married and was having a family. Not the best way to realise these things, of course. So, over the next 5 or 6 years, I obtained my history degree, I obtained my postgraduate diploma in education, I became a high school teacher and developed an insatiable thirst for learning. And this desire to obtain knowledge, to learn new things, to work out how the world turns and how people treat each other is something that I find fascinating. So we get to about 2016. Tracy and I have been raising the 7 children while I've worked for several years as a history teacher. Our daughters have eventually married their returned missionary husbands. We have our first grandchildren. Our oldest son, Ben, has been serving a mission for the church in Belgium and the Netherlands. Both of us have committed all of our adult lives to accepting any responsibility asked of us in the Mormon church. We've paid our 1/10 of our income to the church through tithing because it's a major doctrine and practice. We've lived through the ups and downs of life, trying to learn from our mistakes, attempting to balance our time between family, church and employment. But in my mind, and through just feelings of unease, I have these legitimate doubts. I have unanswered questions about some of the doctrines, the principles and practices and history of the church. A church that I devoted my entire life to. Now, this didn't happen all of a sudden, and I certainly did not look for it. I didn't ask for it. It is, however, a painful and traumatic process that people tend not to seek out. What I absolutely know is that those doubts were not and are not the work of some adversary of God. No devil or demon has been whispering in my ear. In Mormonism, the faithful members are consistently reminded that doubting thoughts come from the devil. In recent years, church leaders have suggested that members, quote, doubt your doubts before you doubt your faith, close quote, and to put difficult questions or issues on a cognitive shelf of some kind. Of course, this is an extremely manipulative move on the part of church leadership. It is, in fact, a damaging form of psychological manipulation, commonly referred to as gaslighting. Sometimes it's been described as the ostrich effect or the Semmelweis reflex, where people bury their head in the sand. Essentially, what it means is that new knowledge is systematically rejected because it contradicts deep, entrenched norms of belief, what we already believe. When we're faced with that new knowledge, we just can't accept that that is the case. And this is a typical method of control in cult-like organizations. So these legitimate doubts simply manifested over time. And I think my educational background started me on the path of questioning what I'd always taken as gospel truth. To me, I was finding wisdom from the best books. Other books about this remarkable world that we live in that told me how the world works. Because my religion had instilled in me an inherent mistrust in sources of information that were critical of the Mormon faith. Any other ex-Mormon or currently transitioning church member will no doubt recognise this. The thought of such emotional and psychological control by a self-described Christian sect that goes at great length to proclaim its own foundation and truth, I suppose that might cause some people to feel angry or emotional. So this is where I really tell the story of my journey out of what I would describe a cloud of social and emotional darkness in the Mormon church and out into a fulfilling and warm burst of light as I've left the church. It sounds good. It sounds like I've progressed, and I absolutely have. But it is an absolute upheaval. It is a trauma to experience, and one that is sadly but necessarily repeated more often in recent years. I've watched countless family and friends go through this psychological ordeal, and I realise the reality that it is such an earth-shattering and deeply personal journey. A journey that I don't think any reasonable and good human being would seek to invalidate or make a mockery of. Yet sadly, some active Mormons do just that. They mock or they patronise those who are going through a faith transition, a difficult journey. So, Mormon general authorities love a really good analogy. So here's my analogy. The best analogy I can think of to explain how one recovers from a lifetime spent as a devoted member of a controlling religious organisation is to describe it as stripping many layers of paint from a wooden door. Over time, this plain but untouched item has been coated over, sometimes with good intention, with layer upon layer of paint. Scratches, blemishes, marks have got to be hidden. With each application, there has been an ever-increasing accumulation of decoration, that has covered up the genuine object underneath, the original door. And this process has meant that any desire to view the original surface of the door requires a similar amount of stripping back, removing those layers laboriously that have been built up over time, so that the original door might be revealed underneath. In some ways, I feel like I'm like this door. I'm not sure I even know what the door is. I'm not sure who Drew Hunter is before Mormonism or out with Mormonism. I'm trying to understand it. What would I be like? This is a question that my wife Tracy asks often. She feels that the real version of herself has never really been there, or that knowing who that real person would be is going to require a great deal of time to realise. The point is, there may very well be aspects of my Mormon life that have made me a better person. I completely accept that. I have good memories. I remember some of the good things. I try to be as objective and honest in the analysis of my life as I can be. However, I hope it will become clear as I continue. The major aspects of my life and the lives of my family, more importantly my children, were very much under the control of an organisation whose headquarters were on the other side of the world, that told us what we should be, what we should do, and that abused our trust. I am one of several thousand Scots who were also Mormons, way back in the days of Alexander Wright, Samuel Mulliner, and the Hay family in the 1840s, the first converts to the church in Scotland. I'm just one of a long line of Scots who was also a Mormon living in Scotland, and one of several million Mormons in the world. But here I am. Here are many of us Scottish Mormons are living in an age when it is beyond impossible for organisations to control the narrative anymore. The internet has become, to modern Mormons and many other people, what the printing press was to Protestantism around the time of the Reformation. The pattern is essentially the same. Bibles were being read in the native tongue and caused an eventual boom in literacy in Europe and beyond. This established conditions that enabled reformers to break away from the monopolising rule of the Holy Roman Empire and expose the hypocrisy and greed of the church. The internet has created instantaneous accountability too, but in a larger and faster way. Accountability towards an individual or group attempting to manipulate or hide the deep-rooted theological facts. Facts that put the entire foundation of a church on very sandy ground. I don't think for a second that I'm the wisest man in the world. But I acknowledge that a religion that claims a foundation in Christ is equally claiming a standard to which it really has to be held. I feel as if I've taken the Great Mormon test that investigators of the church are asked to take. I've asked questions about the church, and I've found the answers. It is built on a sandy foundation. Going through a faith crisis, like coming out of the Mormon church, seems very similar to a personal renaissance in some ways. To me, ironically, it feels like a rebirth. And I feel as if I want to put a pin on an important aspect of Mormonism. church members have repeatedly taught that the organisation of the church is perfect, but the people are not. I disagree with that. One part of that idiom is true. People are imperfect, but the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is imperfect too. I'll explain that, and I'll explain why as I relate the experiences of my family and myself and refer to the way the church actually performs its business. And this brings me to the core reasons for me leaving Mormonism. As a historian, the undiluted facts of the past I consider to be sacred. Interpretation of the past is not a risk-free discipline. However, many great academics have shown that careful analysis and critical reasoning can lead to a greater understanding of connected events. For many years in the Mormon Church, the discipline of historiography has been offensively applied as institutional pressure to create an image of a legitimate religion has emerged as a key priority of the church. Transparency and Mormonism are not mutually exclusive. The events of the restoration of the church are considered to be extremely hallowed, unquestionably factual. And please trust me when I say that I have taken the time to do what a good historian should, to patiently research a variety of sources and interpret those sources as objectively and humanly possible. Mormonism takes its own history and spins it in ways that would impress even the most creative of fascists. But regardless of what I learned about the various histories, the many contradictory accounts of Joseph Smith's first vision, or of the realities of the supposed translation of the golden plates into the Book of Mormon, it wasn't actually the deliberate mistruths of Mormon history that had the greatest effect on my rejection of the church. It's actually been the treatment and effects of this religion on other people, particularly my children. To me, the single greatest problem in the world that human beings face is how people treat other people. How we communicate, how organisations dominate individuals' lives, how we react, what motivates us, and the underlying reasons why people behave the way they do. So my experience in rejecting Mormonism is very much grounded in its clear mistreatment of many people. It makes me think of what H.K. Chesterton said when he gave his critique of Christianity, when he said, "The Christian ideal has not been tried and found wanting. It has been found difficult, and left untried." That's how I see the Mormon Church. Several years ago now, one of our sons, came to us, his parents, and one evening he came to the home to tell us that he was bisexual. At this time, we were still attending church and would be considered active members. That night we reacted with what I would describe as instantaneous love for our son. As far as we were concerned, this did not change a thing. For us, it was family first. In spite of our mistakes and regular imperfections in parenting, which are many, we always put our children first. So we couldn't accept that he was in some way not good enough or was impure in the eyes of the Mormon Church. As time went by, our views on homosexuality and church teachings about homosexuality grew much further apart. My personal attitude towards people of different sexualities has become less judgmental and far more understanding. Our son has been to hell and back and still bears those scars. He was raised in a strict Mormon household where the traditional heterosexual family model was emphasized as not only the norm, but as the only acceptable type of family to God. I find it difficult to even conceive of how that must have made our son feel when he was younger. How must this have caused him so much pain and anxiety? And at the time, my wife and I didn't even know. But now we do. Since then, we've had another son who's come to us and explained his sexual orientation to us. We are grateful to now be in a position that allows him to know with a surety that we accept him because he's our child, our son. In our family, respect for the individual supersedes everything else. We have to respect each other. I know that Mormon doctrine and culture would judge us as parents who have surrendered our God-fearing faith and his moral principles. I'm just thankful that my understanding of the complex nature of human sexuality is no longer based on archaic forms of dogmatic rules. We used to have a much revered Mormon document hanging in a lovely frame in our hallway. It was called The Family, A Proclamation to the World. In it was contained a statement made by the presiding leaders of the church, containing the Mormon doctrine of what constitutes a family. Among other ideas, there was included the sanctity of marriage, and that is marriage specifically between a man and a woman. Homosexual relationships or marriage remains prohibited and an offence to God in Mormonism. Now, I am not in any way suggesting that my views or the experience of my children ought to be a reason for a change in doctrine within the Mormon Church, because the Church has drawn a line in the sand there. But I speak as a father. The long-term effects of Mormon policy and doctrine on my children's ability to process their identities has been significant. This is their reality and their experience. Needless to say, thankfully, that framed Mormon doctrine no longer hangs on our wall and hasn't for a long time. Sometime in recent years, not long after our daughters were married, another one of our sons began a full-time mission for the church. For over 1 year, he spent time away from us, as is the tradition in Mormonism, while he immersed himself in proselyting and doing missionary work. So he used this time to find and teach people as he served in Belgium and the Netherlands, in the hope that they would convert to Mormonism and be baptized. Everything seemed to be going well until one Christmas time that he spent away from us. In a video call, out of nowhere, he told us that he was depressed. Tracy and I knew there was something different as soon as we saw him in the video. He was struggling a lot, and he told us there and then that he wanted to come home. I've since learned how common this is for serving missionaries in the church around the world. In fact, it's a serious issue for many, with the rising numbers of young men and women suffering from severe mental health issues while out in their missions. So without getting into too much detail, I actually had to have a series of phone calls with his ecclesiastical leader, his mission president. In these calls, we were told that Ben was being cared for, that being this way on a mission was not unusual, and that everything would be done to keep him in the mission field. And it's a sad reality, and perhaps unsurprising, there is a shame associated with young missionaries who return home early from their mission. This is one of those damaging cultural isms that seem to permeate the church. Therefore, we as his parents felt pulled from several sides over the issue. Here was our own child, our son. He was vulnerable and seemed to be suffering emotionally while away from us in a foreign country with no family member there. Could he remain in the field, we asked ourselves? With help and with medical attention, couldn't he continue his mission? These are the thoughts that we were having. But in reality, this was causing us so much anguish and sleepless nights that it became unbearable. As the phone calls from Ben got more worrying, and as the mission president spoke with me throughout the whole process, my wife and I realised that Ben was not being taken proper care of. His well-being was not being fully considered. Rather, the leaders in his mission were attempting to damage limitation, I suppose, with his needs coming second to the mission itself. If he left the mission field early, it would be another negative statistic that did not reflect well on the mission president. In fact, the truth is, it felt like our son was being held against his will and manipulated by church leadership. That might sound as if I'm being hyperbolic, but it was really happening, and it's exactly how it felt. So just as I was about to book flights to fly to the Netherlands and bring him home myself, thankfully a local church leader here at home intervened and ensured that Ben was sent back home to us almost imminently. The relief was unbelievable. We were thankful for the part played by that leader of the church at the time. In the aftermath of this experience, my wife and I were able to process what had gone on. This was not an isolated incident. This was not simply an example of misguided leadership. This was a systemic and cultural issue that was completely preventable. We were aware of other young people on this mission who were just not being taken care of, where parents of missionaries actually flew to Belgium and physically took their own child back home. Now, to this point, I've only referred to 2 personal experiences where our children have been directly and adversely affected by the teachings, policies, and culture of Mormonism. Our other children have been going through a psychological minefield of recovery as well, dealing with so much in recent years. My 2 daughters have had so much emotional and psychological baggage to unpack as females who had excessively high expectations placed on them from a young age. For me, that is enough to make my mind up. However, these awful experiences didn't occur in isolation. They have both unfolded in the context of myself and my wife Tracy going through our own faith crises, in which really the head as well as the heart was completely challenged. Which brings me on to some of the issues that I have with Mormonism itself as an organisation. I enjoy studying Reformation history and the emergence of Protestantism in Catholic Europe, and I really enjoy some of the letters sent between church leaders, Protestant Catholic church leaders and humanists. And there is this wonderful quote, this statement that was written by Ulrich Wiest in Augsburg in 1450, where he wrote a letter commenting on the church and his concerns about the church, where he said, quote, Christians do not give donations to see them wasted on unchristian pomp and partying. With donations, they gamble and give parties. With donations, they buy, invest, and sell for profit. Close quote. At one stage, my wife and I found ourselves in a situation where, in order to pay our required amount of tithing to the church, 1/10 of our monthly or annual income, we had to take out a loan. We put ourselves in debt in order to be obedient to God, to be good church members, and be allowed to enter a Mormon temple. We were told by local church leaders that previous amounts of tithing that had not been paid were owed to the church in instalments. Without paying that tithing, we would not be blessed and would not gain entry into the Mormon temple. The pressure we put ourselves under at this time was immense. Apparently, we were in financial debt to God, which I found difficult to process. It was awful and it was immoral. Of course, I could tell that what those leaders were doing at the time was not formal church policy or doctrine in many instances. I'm more than willing to accept the old adage that church members are not perfect, as I said earlier. However, I don't think that serves as a convenient escape clause when people experience systematic manipulation in this way, whether knowingly or through plain ignorance. When I was in a situation where I had been asked to be a member of a high council in the area that I lived, I remember stake leaders standing in front of us, telling us that many members of the stake were not full tithe payers and that something had to be done about it. I remember comments being made about certain members of the stake who had a particular career. Judgments about their incomes were thrown about as members of stake presidencies would rant about their lack of faithfulness. I often found myself coming home from these uncomfortable meetings and telling my wife, Tracy, how terrible this made me feel, how unpleasant and negative it felt to hear these judgments of people being made. I personally was questioned about my tithe payments by a particularly judgmental stake presidency member. Knowing that I was a school teacher, he had clearly researched my salary based on the years that I had been in the post to that point, and without any concept or knowledge of our financial circumstances or commitments, he judged me to not be a faithful tithe payer. And in many ways, this experience with that church leader became what I call my critical event. That flipped a switch in my conscience. And in light of recent emerging scandals where the Mormon Church has been shown to have amassed an unseemly fortune of well over $100 billion, in addition to the excessive stipend payments to certain members of general leadership, also the current investigation in Australia where it seems that the Mormon Church has been taking advantage of loopholes in tax laws to further line its own pockets, the building of a super mall in Salt Lake City, and the almost endless supply of money paid out in settling the growing child abuse cases against the church. With all of this in mind, I simply cannot accept that this organisation has any moral standing, any more than I see with my own eyes an organisation that is very antithesis of what is commonly referred to as a Christian church. I came to realise quite a long time ago that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is no more than just a corporate business entity, and a very, very powerful one at that. It's a quasi-religious Ponzi scheme in which its depleting membership is unwittingly duped into unquestioning obedience through long-established techniques of psychological manipulation. The Mormon Church is a highly motivated and sophisticated cult, and it's had almost 200 years to harness those systems of control. I taught senior classes in group psychology during my career, and I understand manipulative cult-like practices. Whereas previously I would not even entertain the possibility that this church, which I saw as the one true church, could be included even in the category of being a cult. It's now objectively clear to me, without any ulterior motivation, that the Mormon Church absolutely meets many of the features of a mind-controlling or brainwashing cult. There is behavior control over its members. It has information control over its members. It's geared towards thought control, and probably most destructively so, it's got significant features of emotional control over its members. These are the established identifiers referred to in Stephen Hassan's BITE model of cult and authoritarian groups, which is also something I taught in high school. And that's when I realised I was part of this. And while active LDS church members would be absolutely flabbergasted at the mere suggestion that their belief system is categorised as a cult, I'm going to be absolutely clear and reiterate that in terms of contemporary academic study, based on religious group structure and control mechanisms, the LDS Church is a classic cult. And it is a significant and it is a damaging one at that. Now, all of this is objectively harmful enough, but one of the most stark realities of Mormonism is how obsessed the organisation is with its own image, which is yet another symptom of group control dynamic. I've never understood the fascination with image perception over reality. Happy faces, shiny countenances, intelligence, wisdom, contentment, the perfect Mormon family, and personal righteousness. These are some of the projected traits that people in the church wish to have non-Mormons see within them. This relates to part of the official name of the church as saints. This is a powerful label that gives members an almost godly feeling and sense of separation from the rest of the world. As well as being a prime identifier of cult-like behaviour, this saintliness is similar to the old Protestant doctrine of separation or non-fellowship. Scriptural justifications for this religious self-view are scattered throughout biblical passages. But I think of more concern as the official organisational drive within the church to control its own image. The Mormon Church is obsessed with its image. The public relations department is devoted to this cause. So much time and money is thrown into the creation of a perfect projection, a squeaky, clean imitation of the real church. For me, that is a huge red flag. It even infects local congregations all over the world. Statistics, numbers, box ticking, these are all obsessions of the way that the church is run. The suggestion that the church is faltering as an organisation is regularly denied or avoided. It's always growing, it's always successful, there are always good stories, and it's always good news. Never shrinking, never failing, no negatives, no bad news. I've even witnessed local leaders so caught up in the game of protecting that positive image that they mislead and speak dishonestly, even when they're reporting on the progress of the church at a local level. Sometimes it seems they've lost an entire grip on reality. And I see this as another warning sign of a religious organisation that possesses those cult-like traits. A question I find myself asking in various situations I come across is this question: am I being duped into accepting something that is not what it seems? And I usually follow up that question with, could this thing, this organisation, be genuine? And I see this as an important way of measuring the social worth of a group or an organisation, or even of individuals as well. I think it's of the utmost importance to be made aware of all the facts, unedited, unfiltered, free of cherry picking, free of exaggeration or interpretation or opinion. Just the facts. It's become mainstream to be aware of a phenomenon that we call toxic positivity, to suppress negative emotions in all walks of life. The assumption behind those who adhere to this kind of toxic positivity is that no good can be achieved if we dwell on the more unpleasant aspects of a particular thing. Therefore, we must always look towards and infer the positive. But this is in itself a psychologically damaging pursuit. I think this is a mindset that tends towards a blissful ignorance. It allows narcissistic individuals to flourish and seek to alter your reality. The Mormon Church exudes toxic positivity in its leadership, in its media, in its public image. In a mass gaslighting effort, the Mormon Church wants to divert your gaze towards only the wholesome aspects and away from the poison that's within, away from anything that will allow investigation or for you to address the most pressing questions about its organisational foundation. Recently in the UK, there's been a closure of a stake in England. I think it's the Lichfield stake, including 3 congregations and 2 buildings. In Scotland, units have closed in some stakes in recent years, and the party line, the approach to explaining this to the local membership, is to expound out a thesaurus of positivity and love in denial of objective reality. The church is shrinking in the UK and has been for some time. What I see is more positivity for the sake of image, not for the sake of honesty or welfare. It reminds me of the countless times I spent in leadership meetings at ward and state levels, where the presiding leaders would repeat over and over and over that the priesthood holders or other church members were simply not doing enough. The blame for lack of growth is thrown out to the exhausted, hard-working people who are already stretched to breaking point. This kind of petty tyranny is what you get when accountability is aimed downward to the general membership. Responsibility is offloaded to the nearest unquestioning followers who will take the blame. So it should not come as too much of a surprise that the triple combination of a strictly unquestionable hierarchy, a doctrinally based focus on separation from the Gentile world, along with the historical emphasis on organisational perfection, would lead to a church that has numerical data as one of its most prized indicators of success. Numbers come before individuals. this isn't so much about the one lost sheep being of value to the shepherd, who's meant to be Christ. This is about this church making sure the world knows that there are 100 members, even if one of them isn't interested. If the lost sheep were really as valued as those verses in the New Testament state, perhaps the organisation would genuinely make an attempt at introspection to learn why they are losing so many members, why they are losing those sheep. And that ratio today is far larger than 100 members to that one lost. Maybe the comparison with a docile farm creature that displays a flocking instinct is far too apt. So I'm going to add on to this and take this to yet another more damaging level in the absolute focus created within Mormonism that righteousness or absolute obedience is directly linked to monetary success. This gospel of prosperity is obviously not a distinctly Mormon trait. It has its roots in late 19th century Protestant church. Perhaps it should come as no surprise that a church created by a young Eastern State American boy apparently immersed in what seemed to be a melting pot of Protestant religiousness would be geared towards individualism and wealth. So today, for many Mormons, your individual success, your education level, where you study, your career, your bank balance, what you live in, and what you drive, these are all indicators of your level of personal devotion to the church and to God. This is connected to your tithe payments. And while this cultural emphasis on wealth-based religious dogma is actually downplayed by church leaders, it is intertwined in the American religious organisation that Mormonism is. It is part of the complex cultural soup of Latter-day Saint life. As I stated earlier, it's also linked theologically with the practice of the tithe, and I think by any subjective interpretation of a rather obscure verse in an Old Testament book, the Mormon Church has created this law, the law of tithing, a law that's not particular to Mormonism. It's another obscure theological practice that several other religious groups have used before Mormonism even existed and have since. The law requires absolute obedience and sacrifice. In doing so, and in connection with a whole range and raft of demands placed on members, many of the members are faced with very risky moral dilemmas such as feeding your family, paying your rent or medical bills while feeling pressure to use what little money you have to pay your tithe to the church. When we hear about the outcome of these damaging dilemmas of choice from the pulpit on a Sunday, or from general authorities at conference or in a church magazine article, we always hear the success story, the fulfillment of the promise and the blessings resulting from the obedience of the tithe payer. Wonderful stories. But this is disingenuous, unfair, and it's an abuse of authority. Never mind being a terrible example of intelligent reasoning, it's just misleading. Biases that reinforce your existing views are repeated and repeated and encouraged within Mormonism. We don't hear the terrible stories, the horror stories. It is a basic fallacy of logical reasoning to seek out only the information that simply confirms what you already know or are trying to find being reinforced. That's, I suppose, critical thinking 101. A healthy and transparent organisation is structured in such a way that problems, as much as successes, are given equal attention. Otherwise, you are simply engaged in an exercise of eternal neglectfulness in a time when increasing costs of living put families in dilemmas of choice between feeding their children or paying energy bills. A Mormon family would be expected to pay what little they have to the church. Now, please remember that top line of over 100 billion that the Mormon Church holds in reserve. That's the kind of information we really need to know. And to continue this topic, in many years as a priesthood leader, I've listened to some ecclesiastical leaders infer the most harsh judgments on church members who struggled to pay their 1/10, such as their inability to pay that tithing is down to their poor financial management. The truth is far more upsetting and speaks of the harshness that emerges from a controlling organisation such as the Mormon Church. If you have been one of those tithe payers in the past who was faced with those terrible choices and you made those choices, to be told that you must pay that money to God first, that pressure you felt was not your fault. You were a victim of dogmatic abuse, and that is something you can recover from, you can learn from. I think often of the leadership of the church, and certainly in the last few years after I left, I was reminded of something that I read when I was in my 4th year of university. I'm a big fan of Erasmus, the humanist, at the time of the Reformation in Europe, and he observed this about the church. He said, quote, "Because of the leniency and indulgence of the popes, the whole situation has been made worse. There is nothing more vile and ungodly than this sort of loose religious behaviour. I doubt that anyone could identify Christ's image." And this is where I refer to something that I've often found very distasteful in recent years. I find the putting of people on pedestals really off-putting. There are people in life who I look up to, absolutely. There are people in history I admire. I also recognise the dangers of allowing a person to be so publicly admired that their own sense of importance becomes a huge stumbling block. In the Mormon Church, members are repeatedly taught that Jesus Christ is the God that is to be worshipped. Heavenly Father is God also. To worship another person is warned against. The biblical record and Mormon standard works contain the theological framework for who God is and how that being ought to be worshipped. And now I'll not get into some of the contradictory statements about God the Father and God the Son in the Book of Mormon, its initial manuscript versions, or any inconsistencies of the Godhead theology. But I do want to elaborate on Christian worship in the context of Mormonism. I felt deeply uncomfortable with the levels of expected adoration, veneration, and exaltation towards general authorities in the LDS Church. A general authority is a Mormon leader who has, for want of a better phrase, worked through the ranks of priesthood leadership to the point that they are deemed ready to be called of God and be responsible for a region, area, or nation wherever the church has congregations anywhere in the world. This is when a man has been perhaps a bishop or a stake or mission president, for example. There is another unfortunate Mormon culturalism that creates this image of a general authority that elevates the person. In the church, they might not accept that this is the case, But personal righteousness, which is a weak and rather vain measure of what ought to be a good person in a Christ-focused way, personal righteousness is seen as very important for church leaders. While some church leaders have given sermons and taught that a good leader is a humble person, loving, empathetic, kind, meek, and so forth, traits that we really ought to desire in people who profess to represent the Christ of the New Testament, it does seem to have escaped the general leadership of the Mormon Church that those principles of human servitude and humble servitude should be genuinely exemplified by them. I've known lots of compassionate and humble church leaders in Mormonism. I also think some of the general authorities have been those kind of humble and good people too. But more so in recent years, I've noticed this elevation of status becoming an issue for some of the most senior leaders in the church. And it certainly is a problem that trickles down naturally to the local level. I believe that if you have an authoritative and divine claim to be the leader of the faith, whatever that may be, the president, the prophet, seer, the revelators in Mormonism, I believe that the attitudes and behaviour of those closest to you can be a reflection of how you wish to be seen. When the wife of a church president makes public statements that elevate her own husband's status to more than the servant he is claiming to be, then I see that as another red flag. I recognise a very distinct form of elitism in all of this, and it is not pleasant to see. It actually causes me to think that the people in these powerful positions need some kind of intervention for their distasteful fawning and their aggrandisement of each other. It's uncomfortable to watch, and it seems completely at odds with Christ-focused religious belief. Some years ago, one of the general authorities gave a sermon comparing the 12 apostles in the first presidency with the meek and lowly who will inherit the earth, as referenced in the New Testament, in the book of Psalms also, but significantly it was referenced in the Sermon on the Mount. I was absolutely struck by the mental gymnastics used by this speaker in attempting to conflate wealthy, highly educated members of boards of directors, shareholders in large companies, lawyers, academics, millionaires, senior vice presidents, and to compare this with the poorest, most humble and forgotten people who would come to inherit the earth upon Christ's return to it. Is that how out of touch and how privileged some of these men have become? The socio-economic gap between these privileged men who lead the church and poverty-stricken indigenous people in, for example, sub-Saharan Africa or parts of South America could not be clearer. Brigham Young once said, quote, "I am fearful that they settle down in a state of blind self-security, trusting their eternal destiny in the hands of their leaders with a reckless confidence." Now, I don't quote Brigham Young loosely because of the type of man that I see him to have been and a lot of the decisions that he made. But I just think it's interesting to use that statement where he describes how members should not hold unquestioning trust to church leaders. There's an irony there in some ways. So having discussed the corporate nature of the organisation that endeavours to create this fairy tale image of its own greatness and the distasteful way that general leaders are put on pedestals while running a multi-billion-dollar huge church, I'm reminded of a part of the Book of Mormon that brings to light those very same issues. Now, as an ex-Mormon, it might seem counterintuitive to quote texts from their own scriptures or from their leaders, but I'm aware of the authority that people put onto the Book of Mormon as an LDS text. In Mormonism, the Book of Mormon is described as the keystone of the religion. It is described as the most correct of any book on earth, albeit in terms of the Christological themes throughout it. Putting the series of grammatical errors and even the doctrinal inconsistencies aside, I want to make reference to the fact that in Mormonism, the Book of Mormon is seen as a witness and a warning, and as a voice crying from the dust. In all my years of growing up, reading and studying those scriptures, learning about the teachings contained in them, it was very clear that the Book of Mormon was to be a warning to the latter-day members of the church, as well as the Lamanites who would be alive today, who are meant to be Native Americans in North and South America, which is a whole other question, and by extension the world. In other words, lessons from that sacred record were to be learned so that the members of the modern church today wouldn't fall into the same unpleasant traps of the people described in the Book of Mormon. I was always drawn to the verses in the Book of Mormon that spoke about the pride of the church, of the ways that church members would treat non-members badly, how they would become arrogant, obsessed with wealth. I had to seriously consider if this was me too sometimes, in moments of introspection. Now consider the Book of Alma, chapter 4, verses 9 to 11. In it we are told that the membership of the church itself was so filled with pride that it began to affect the progress of the church. Now, I wonder if that important lesson is one that could apply to the current church today. I see similarities. As an ex-Mormon, the book itself holds no relevance to me anymore, yet I do find some of those things fascinating. If a book is theologically intended to serve as a guide to the running of the church and as a guide to Christ-like living, I wonder sometimes how literal those warnings ought to be taken. And I also wonder why verses such as these are lightly passed over and hardly noteworthy in the culture of the church. Speaking of verses that are passed over, at times, especially as I've watched the religion of my childhood, which did resemble a Christian organisation, becoming more like a Fortune 500 multinational company, I've had echoes of the supposed events described in books such as Helaman and 3rd Nephi, where the chosen or the select people have really lost their way. In Mormon doctrine, this is known as the pride cycle. In historical schools of thought, particularly the cultural materialism branch of history, this would be a very simplistic description of empire erosion. It is a valid description of how a society can implode through the creation of classes of people, with an elite group allowing a bureaucratic rot to take hold. Could there be an ideological rot in the core of Mormonism? Could a latter-day Samuel the Lamanite emerge from the shadows to point out perhaps the obvious? If no powerful interventionist figure comes forward to point out the obvious issues in an organisation that seems to be so bereft of a genuine moral backbone, I sometimes wonder what the president of the LDS Church would do instead. Mormons are taught that their leaders in Salt Lake City are prophets of God. This pattern began with the religion's founder, Joseph Smith. The identification of a religious group's holy leaders as prophets is a very Abrahamic thing. The main Abrahamic religions, Christianity, but especially Judaism and Islam, have this structural theological foundation of prophetic ministry. In terms of what we read in the main religious texts, such as the Bible, the Talmud, the Quran, and some of the apocryphal texts, a prophet is one who utters forth messages from deity to the people of the religion itself, but also to the world. The collective term for those divine utterances, sometimes prophecy, is revelation. There is a strange kind of irony in Mormon doctrine that any church member can receive revelation from God under the required spiritual conditions, yet LDS general authorities are designated as the only representatives on earth to receive that revelation for the church. So in all of this is a suggestion that Mormonism is a living, breathing faith, one that is vibrant, adaptive, and, dare I say, progressive. However, you don't have to scratch the surface of the church too much to see that the authority of its chosen leaders is meant to be taken as infallible, except of course when utterances from God's anointed are merely opinion rather than revealed truth, which is a useful escape clause sometimes. It reminds me of that medieval notion that abounded in European society when the authority of the church was unquestionably the only source of acceptable wisdom. The traditional ideas of the past were seen as the most worth. Present-day people were kept in their place, willfully ignorant, because the God who favoured Latin and the Bible was the only true and living God. Mormonism is simply another manifestation of this effort to control the masses. Each succeeding prophet, meaning the president of the church, is a caretaker of the keys that allow for this authority to be passed on. Additionally, a prophet can be said to predict what may occur in the future with a warning attached that, if it is heeded, may reduce the cataclysmic consequences of the prophecy. This is where the title seer comes from. LDS prophets and men who are called apostles are officially given this title also. So the theological foundation of prophets in Mormonism is again taken from allusions to it in the New Testament. The main religious text of Mormonism, the Book of Mormon, also takes this principle and contains descriptions of prophets from the beginning of the book. Now, from biblical to Mormon descriptions of what a prophet concerns himself with, we have plenty of subject matter to work from. Now, it can be Abraham being the father of the covenant people, or Moses calling on the Egyptians to set the Jews free. It can be Jonah being called upon to tell an entire city to repent, a father in Jerusalem being given a heavenly motif or vision where he is commanded to take his family and travel to a new land of promise. It could be a prophet king who's told to teach all of his people how to love one another and work with them in the fields, or it could be another prophet who is commanded to collect, edit, and bury a secret, sacred record to be brought forth for a later time. This pattern of prophetic expediency and this sense of necessity for the world to be made aware of God's desires for humankind seem to have really dried up in most of the years of Mormonism. After Joseph Smith's apparent revelations compiled into the Doctrine and Covenants and then the official declarations, there hasn't been much of urgency for God to tell Mormon prophets over and above sudden revelations to align with national laws on polygamy or the treatment of black people. I've mentioned the Proclamation on the Family, published in 1995. However, LDS prophets seem to be having what they seem to be having revealed to them in what is considered by the church as the last dispensation before the return of Christ is lacking in serious global importance. Look at the world we live in a world that is clamouring for peace, equality, love, truth. A world torn apart by ignorance, tribalism, wars in the Middle East, Africa, Europe, actual genocides taking place today, intense corruption in politics all over the world, natural disasters, and all manner of diseases and illnesses. It looks like the Mormon prophets have developed a case of selective hearing. And I say this because if a deity is watching what is unfolding, and I assume still wants to use prophets to get their messages across to humanity, then the really important stuff is very thin on the ground. Unless, of course, the following kinds of revelations are more important than all of those grave worldwide matters I mentioned. For example, a revelation that children of same-sex couples cannot be baptized. A revelation contradicting God's previous revelations telling the church that the term Mormon isn't acceptable anymore in the church. Revelations asking the worldwide church to fast because of the COVID pandemic and the war in Ukraine, all to no effect, it would seem. A revelation that people like me and countless others are lazy learners for doubting the faith. Several revelations to build more lavish and expensive temples in what seems to be a vanity project by the recent prophet. I spent my childhood, my youth, and most of my adult life reading about the remarkable interventions made by prophets, massively important messages, warnings laid at the feet of corrupt leaders in what Mormons call the dispensation of the fullness of times, when messages from God would surely be for a global audience. That pattern simply doesn't exist in the current Mormon church. Instead, there has become a succession of men who are relentlessly preoccupied with policy adaptation in an organization that is simply a corporation with a board of directors trying to exert all manner of restrictions over the moral agency of its members. Men who are receivers of the most extravagant flattery from other leaders and members. Men who are ego-stroking at a level that is so far from being Christ-like, who themselves are worshipped, and all of it is classical, institutional, cult behaviour. Now, I realise that perhaps some active Mormons may listen to this and they will react defensively as a matter of instinct. I completely understand that. This would have been me several years ago, no doubt. The nature of this video and the content in it might appear as offensive to some people. Others may take it very personally. I simply wish to bring to light an organisation that is misleading and is realistically dangerous. I stated at the outset of my comments that critical thinking, objective and logical reasoning as part of the historical discipline are extremely important to me. Being part of an organisation that uses emotional and mental manipulation to ensure obedience, an organisation that knowingly misleads its membership and closes down all natural human instinct to question and act upon legitimate doubts. This is not an organisation I can either be a member of or be associated with. It goes against everything I stand for and hold to be the essence of human existence. I'm not trying to change it. What could I achieve? I'm no longer a member of that church. My stated objective is to inform, but also to find ways of processing the 40 or so years of my life I lived as a member of that church. I've had to receive counselling. I am currently receiving counselling. In my line of work, I understand the unequaled value of therapy. Making this video, making this has been part of that healing process. But there's still so much that I need to come to terms with. For any church member or individual currently transitioning away from Mormonism, I would say this. It will not always be difficult. It's an ongoing process, and although the organisation of the church itself and some of the less compassionate members will try to make you feel foolish, they may even try to demonise you to make your entire experience seem illegitimate or not real. Even, or in particular, the general authorities of the church have and will continue to say things from their podium that suggest you are weak, that you are in the wrong, you are misled, failing in some way. But perhaps most disconcertingly, they will imply that there is nowhere else you can go if you choose to leave the church. They have no right to make you feel this way or to dictate how you find happiness in life, and they are wrong. It might be easy for me to say now, but all I would say is don't worry. There are always listening ears out there. There are an increasing number of people going through the very same trauma. You have the sovereign right to accept or reject Mormonism and not be vilified for your decision. You may notice that previous friends gravitate away from you. Try not to victimize or be critical of them. I often hoped those close ties ran deeper than the church itself. I'm happy to say, though, that there remain quite a few who have continued to value our friendships. So my advice is this: read and read, then read more about all facets of Mormon history. Even the church itself has attempted to take control of the narrative of their own dishonesty by publishing essays. Try not to get angry and lash out when discussing your experiences, is what I would say, especially during a faith crisis. Sometimes we say things that we later regret. I've done this. Often the anger just boils it up into bitterness. It's understandable. Being angry is going to be a natural emotional reaction. There is a necessary place for it in transition out of the Mormon Church or any authoritative group. Just don't let it consume you. Also, remember that when you engage in discussions with active Mormons and they don't see things your way, don't be surprised, because that used to be you. Now, finally, there are lots of self-professed Mormons and Christians in the world who are genuinely good people, compassionate, caring, respectful. Unfortunately, there are also many self-professing Mormons who struggle with even the most basic teachings of Jesus Christ and who use their religion as a podium for their own pomposity and narcissism. They'll take your words sometimes and your experiences and trample them into the ground, mainly for the enhancement of their own egos. They won't think twice about making a fool of you for personal gain. Compassion, empathy, love, concern, understanding, and all the finer aspects of human nature sometimes aren't found with these people. My advice would be to stay away from them. Don't waste your breath. Don't share the same space with them. I've often said, and this occurs due to the toxic self-righteousness that runs through some of Mormon culture, that there are too many Mormons busy being Mormon who forget that they are supposed to be Christian. And in the past, I've had to include myself in that. Now, in the church, there's been a growing division within its membership that is politically structured. It's the division between liberal or progressive-minded people and those who are conservative or more traditional. This has been a division that has been created for years by several members of its general leadership. It also stems from the organisation's self-image as an American religious organisation that possesses that historical manifest destiny that contributes to that kind of bulldozing sense of theological inevitability. History attests to the relentless cycles of hatred, abuse, and cultural genocide that result from blind collective faith in a charismatic religion. Fundamentalism has been in the DNA of the Mormon Church since its beginning in the early 1800s. The burned-over district in New York State created the perfect conditions for millennial reformist religious groups. Joseph Smith was steeped in this revivalist atmosphere and created his particular group following a pattern that other contemporary groups did too, whether it was the Shakers, the Millerites, or Mormons. They were each a product of that second Great Awakening. After the death of Joseph Smith, fundamentalism became even more fundamental in the LDS Church under the leadership of Brigham Young. During the time known as the Reformation period in the Church, as the Church continued to establish its territory in Utah, President Young became even more accustomed to public statements that contained the kind of rhetoric designed to create an us and them feeling among the church members, particularly in relation to government interference. So emboldened Mormon men would organise themselves into militias or vigilante groups that engaged in attacks on travelling groups or other non-Mormon outsiders. Now, while the church today contains no clear militant action branch that we would say is definite, preferring to focus on a wholesome self-image, it isn't too hard actually to see the simmering fundamentalist factions spread across America and other parts of the world. You can see them online, you can see them on social media and in pockets of mainly right-wing groups. Any organisation that is so inward-focused and ideologically driven by self-interest, an organisation that has a foundation based on historical self-determinism, a radical obsession with a kind of historical manifest destiny, and this constitutionalism, this seems to be an incubator that nurtures and enables all sorts of wild and extreme fantasies. Men such as Ezra Taft Benson, a past president of the church, J. Reuben Clark Jr., having such a huge leadership influence in the past, the more extreme and less tolerant Mormons had a voice and a feeling of legitimacy. Under these conditions, fundamentalism is usually just around the corner, actually. One of the most worrying aspects of toxic Mormon culture today, I think, is the growing number of conspiracists who have taken their religious fervour and their supposed God-given stamp of approval offered by prophets, seers and revelators to flood the internet, social media, with a tidal wave of hate, intolerance, misinformation and self-promotion. The irony in their extremism seems lost on them because the very essence of Christ-like conduct, I think, is almost completely absent. A pattern as well that I've noticed more recently is how the church nurtures a sense of victimhood amongst its members. Not all members. This comes right from the top of its leadership. I believe members of the Mormon Church have the right to defend their faith, absolutely, and it should go without saying. I completely understand that. But when facing criticism from ex-members or non-Mormons and comparing this with the Jewish Holocaust, for example, I can't think of fewer things quite as insensitive and hyperbolic as that kind of comparison. It really shouldn't have to be said, but the suffering of past generations, the xenophobia, racism and prejudice of scapegoated groups in the past does not equate to your defence of your religion on a Facebook group. The Mormon Church has been my life for all of my living memory. I know what good it really has done me, but I cannot escape the damage it's caused me and those I love the most. It does not have a monopoly on truth, and it does not have a moral superiority in the world. There is a life outside of Mormonism, and it is wonderful. There is peace, there is a happiness, a contentment, a sense of purpose I feel less controlled, less judgmental myself, and less judged, and more open to alternative views. I still feel that I'm deprogramming all those years of conformity, but I do feel as if I'm getting there. I'm an advocate for truth, not the personal versions created by subjective thinking and bias. I really mean objective and rational truth. I don't have a religious or political axe to grind in anything that I've said. None of this is politically motivated. But I just want to give others a safe space to openly express their reality, unhindered, without judgment, and in a respectful manner. I'm a Scottish ex-Mormon. I've rejected the religion of my childhood. Feel free to get in touch with me and have a discussion with me. I love doing that. I'm happy to talk with other people. I think the world needs more listeners and thinkers. People who meet in the middle of bridges and speak honestly about things that matter to more of us, instead of shouting from podiums to get the attention of the most people, to get more comments, to get more likes. Instead of an insipid intransigence, instead of using their voice to lessen others and promote themselves, I think the future is a shared space, and we need to all be willing to allow other voices to come to the table, whatever table that is, and we need to do that respectfully. Thank you for listening to my story and my experiences growing up and being an adult Mormon, raising our children in the Mormon Church. And I hope that in some way that it's informed or it's helped. My name is Drew Hunter, and I used to be a Mormon.